As we move into kind of the rules of how today is going to work, so I have asked Cidnee to prepare about a 15-ish minute presentation for us to walk us through the theory as well as the method of what she's done with her research. And then she's going to throw it back to us, and the committee is going to ask questions. And while I know that you guys probably have burning desires of things you want to know, I would wait to ask those perhaps when you're taking her out to dinner in either a celebration or maybe crying. We'll see.
Hopefully the former.
What could happen? What could happen today? We shall see. And so after the committee has deliberated and we've asked her as many questions as we need to, we're going to excuse everybody else out of the room. It'll just be the committee remaining, and then we'll have a final conversation. But you guys don't go far because then we'll welcome you back in the room to talk about next steps from there on. So that's exactly how it's going to work today. For my committee members, do I have any hard stop times? Did you have meetings coming up that we need to manage to? Okay, fantastic, great. Well, I definitely have to be in my car by 2, so okay, at least you know we have a good deadline here. So excellent. So then, without further ado, I want to go ahead and turn it over to Cidnee, who's going to talk to us about her research. And just for her, I brought in the dreaded sugary beverage. Dun dun dun. All right, so Cidnee, please.
Yeah, she would actually send me pictures like, "Oh, I'm looking at your thesis," and there'd be the Diet Pepsi in the background. So that was fun. So as she just said, we're going to be recording, so I just want to make sure we have everything there and here. Okay, great. So as you saw back there are some dream bars. Please feel free to eat.
And they were tasty.
Please feel free to eat more of them. Take the whole pan, whatever you need. There's also water back there if you need it. So, okay, so thank you so much for joining us this Friday afternoon to talk about my thesis. I'm excited to tell you guys everything, and I'm going to start with a very brief overview of the literature, the research setting, and the method, and then we'll dive right into the results and their implications. Okay, so starting with Edward Bernays, the modern father of public relations, the key question we've been trying to answer is, how do we change behavior? And there was a little bit of a departure from that as the field developed, but there's been a recent calling to return to the roots of public relations as a powerful tool for behavior change. So I wanted to look at this in the context of a branded health campaign, as well as look at the digital initiatives in conjunction with the more traditional ones. And I want to do this from a relationship perspective, which is central to public relations. As I alluded to, there was a time when public relations focused on image building, but then in 1984, Ferguson really pushed for the field to focus on relationship. And as scholars tried to respond to that call, these two paradigms began to form. One setting relationship as an independent variable, and then the other setting relationship as a dependent variable. And then in terms of the conceptual definitions, there was confusion there as well, with sometimes definitions being inconsistent, sometimes studies wouldn't have definitions at all. Key and Sean actually reviewed the last few decades of research and found that there was a lot of inconsistency and that studies oftentimes didn't include a definition. So if you look just here between Hahn and Grunig's relationship outcomes, which is looking at relationship as an independent variable, and then Lettingham and Brunig's concepts of relationship, looking at it as a dependent variable, you can already see that there's some similarities. Sometimes they even have the exact same names, despite the fact that they're really looking at relationship in different ways. And then if you also consider that Hahn and Grunig had relationship maintenance strategies, you see even more overlap here. And you can imagine why this was so confusing in the field. So these two paradigms continue to grow, with Key and Hahn in 2007 finding that Hahn's relationship outcomes predicted attitude, which in turn predicted behavioral intent. Then the same scholars renaming Hahn and Grunig's relationship maintenance strategies as relationship cultivation strategies and creating a scale to address that. Now, while that's happening, simultaneously, we see this paradigm of relationship as a dependent variable growing, with Ludingham and Brunig in multiple studies looking at it as multidimensional. And then Bruning and Galloway further supporting that it was a multidimensional concept. So Bruning and Ludingham felt that they could design specific strategies tailored to the type of relationship they hoped to impact. In 2006, Sweetser and Kelleher provided further support that relationship was multidimensional with their scale, looking at a communicated commitment and conversational voice. So communicated commitment indicates from the perspective of the public's communication in which members of an organization work to express their commitment to building and maintaining a relationship. And then conversational voice indicates an engaging and natural style of an organization communicating with their target public based on the interactions between individuals in the organization and the publics. And what's important here with Sweetser and Kelleher is that they created an abbreviated scale that was specifically designed to be used in digital context, and they used scales, or items rather, from multiple public relations studies up until that point that looked at relationship. So while all of that crazy land was happening, the world keeps spinning, you guys, and it became more digitized, with the majority of US adults owning cell phones, laptops, social media growing exponentially, with Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram having millions of active users. Practitioners really had to consider, how do we interact with publics in this new digital context? How do we integrate these new tactics with traditional ones? So we see in terms of branding, public relations, and health campaigns and responding to this new digitized era and trying to incorporate relationship with this. So Levy and Garfield said that a brand's essence is transmitted continually via its relationships. And they went on to describe trust as an asset that has to be earned rather than purchased. Kopik said that social media is forcing marketers to think differently and react more quickly. Eric, Padman, and Sweetser found that public relations practitioners were proactive in adopting these new digital initiatives and using them in conjunction with more traditional ones. And Kelleher and Miller found that blog readers had higher conversational voice scores than traditional web page readers. Lee argued that digital technology can help to expand the horizons of medical interaction, and Maher and colleagues found that using an existing social network for health interventions retained more of their participants than creating a network specifically for that intervention. So what we're seeing here is that this new digitized world sparked a relationship-centered perspective across various arenas. It was easier for people to connect with one another, and it shifted the expectations of target publics. Practitioners had to address and foster that human element. I decided to use Rev Your Bev to look at this. As you can see, Dr. Sweetser is revving her Bev.
Very nice.
So Rev Your Bev is a branded health campaign that targets parents of minors in Virginia, and it aims to raise awareness of the risk associated with sugary sweetened beverages, to provide alternatives, and to decrease the intake for both the parents and minors. I suggested 3 models in order to look at this. The first 2 grounded in the research I discussed, and the last proposing a new way to look at relationship, as well as correlational hypotheses. So as you can see here, the first was relationship as an independent variable with some moderators here. And then relationship as a dependent variable. Now those we've already looked at and discussed in terms of the research. I also considered that maybe relationship is actually a moderator, and that's why we're seeing these finding significance in 2 different ways to study relationship. For my first hypothesis, I proposed a direct correlation between the OPR, which is the organization public relationship, and past interactions, as well as direct correlation between the OPR and behavioral intent, and then a direct correlation between behavioral intent and past interactions. So what did I do in order to try and look at this? So I collected a sample for using Amazon Turk, also known as MTurk, and it only comprised of Virginian adults since the campaign is only in Virginia. They were about in their mid-30s, mostly women, mostly Caucasian, and their income was fairly evenly distributed, but more towards the lower end of the income spectrum. I used a survey, so I used Sweetser and Kelleher's relationship measure, and their research looked at relationship as multidimensional. However, my data showed it to be unidimensional in my instance, so that is how I analyzed it and made an index. I also had a behavioral intent measure for oneself, so I intend to drink sugary sweetened beverages versus I intend not to drink sugary sweetened beverages, with a higher number indicating the behavior we want, which is to not drink sugary sweetened beverages. Sweetser hasn't quite gotten that, but that's the idea. And then also one for...
Big sugar doesn't count.
So also one for someone's kid. So do you intend to provide these beverages to your child? And then lastly, an attitude measure with a higher number indicating more positive attitude towards Rev Your Bev. I also asked past interactions, so I had yes or no measures. Have you been to an event? As well as the number of interactions. So how many times have you liked one of Rev Your Bev's posts? I also asked knowledge questions about Rev Your Bev that were yes or no. And I asked their beverage intake, so how many diet sodas have you drank? Or how many ounces of water did you drink? And this was based on the day before they took the survey. And then I also asked demographics, so age, gender, income, ethnicity. All right, guys, let's get to the fun stuff. So I found that this sample actually had fairly healthy drinking habits, with water being the beverage they consumed primarily, or the most. And then I also saw that they had low behavioral intent scores for themselves, moderate ones for their children, low awareness of the brand, and limited knowledge of what Rev Your Bev does. But what's interesting is we saw high attitude scores and moderate relationship scores for this sample. And we'll talk a little more about that. So with the models, there was not significance for the initial zero order correlation, so I was not able to test my beautiful models. And this may be because of the low awareness issue that we had with this sample. So future research would really want to try and address that. For my first hypothesis that proposed a correlation between the OPR and past interactions, there is partially supported. Now, I want to start with explaining why you're seeing a negative correlation here. Originally, I intended to use the ratio data with the number of times you had liked a post or gone to an event, but because I didn't find significance there, I used the yes or no data, with no being a higher number. So Rev Your Bev recently scaled back its events, which may be why we're not seeing anyone reporting attending events. And when they did have events, about 40 people would come. So that may be why we're seeing that here. And then with Facebook, that's a very low sample size. So really and then the correlation values as well are a little on the low end. So you really want to look at this as a trend rather than really strong support for hypothesis 1. For hypothesis 2, we were not able to find support that there was a direct correlation between the OPR and behavioral intent for one's self or for their child. And then for hypothesis 3, we were able to find it was moderately supported. And again, I want to point out with the situation with that negative value so that you're understanding that because no was a higher number than yes in terms of if you had been to an event, the website, or followed the Facebook page. So it's interesting that we're seeing this with the website because Rev Your Bev recently created a very dynamic website experience where you could go in, you could say what you're drinking, and the little sugar meter would fill up, and then they provide alternatives like, well, maybe have your tea unsweetened, and then it would like fade away. So they've really been pushing that, and that may be why we're seeing some more findings with the website. Also with this age group, they're a little bit older with their mid-30s, and so that may be why Facebook wasn't as central for them. In addition to looking at the predictions that I proposed, I also looked at supplementary analysis. For the first 4 bullets here, I ran a bivariate correlation, and then for the last one, I ran a linear regression analysis. As you can see here, there was a negative correlation between behavioral intent for oneself and sugary sweetened beverage intake, as well as one for their child. So what we're seeing here is that what you're saying you're going to do is kind of matching up with what you actually did recently. And then there was also a direct correlation between behavioral intent for oneself and behavioral intent for one's child. Now this is really strong, or I'd say this is moderate, leaning towards strong here, and you can see that there are higher significant values here too. So what's interesting here is that parents may actually decrease the sugary beverages they're providing to their children as it decreases for themselves. Of course, we need more research because we can't say causation here, but the research is pointing to that as a possibility. We also saw that there was a direct correlation between relationship and attitude, which makes sense when you see the last finding with the prediction that attitude predicts relationship. So attitude may actually be an antecedent between behavior and relationship, and this is actually in conflict with previous research by Key and Han in 2007 that said relationship outcomes predict attitude, which predict behavioral intent. To look at differences between groups, I conducted t-tests, and I found that when you compared website visitors against those who had not visited the website, they had higher relationship and attitude scores, as well as higher behavioral intent scores towards one's child. I did a similar thing for our Facebook followers and found that those who followed the Facebook page had higher relationship scores. Again, you want to consider this was a small sample size, so we want to keep that in mind, but we were able to find significance here. And then I compared women and men, finding that women had higher relationship scores and higher attitude scores. So this is really interesting because 2/3 of women handle most of the shopping, and there may be an opportunity to target women in order to decrease the sugary beverage intake in their families. Basically, mothers may be the key, and if you're a mother, I'm sure you would agree with that. Okay, so let's discuss this a little bit further. What we saw in this study was low awareness scores and low sugary sweetened beverage intake. So this is kind of interesting. Regular Bev has been in market for a number of years now. And so that we're still seeing that low sugary sweetened beverage intake despite low awareness of the brand. What may be happening is that the messaging itself is resonating and affecting behavior without the target actually associating the brand with the messaging. So the brand may be able to affect behavior even if respondents don't consciously remember it. And then when you look at that, we found moderate relationship and high attitude scores despite that low awareness. And you consider the brand asset evaluator, which is looking at brand equity on 4 characteristics, which is differentiation, relevance, esteem, and knowledge. You'd probably think that, okay, Regular Bev probably doesn't have the highest brand equity. And then if you also think about Halt's argument that what makes branding so powerful is the nature of a brand's perceptions, and it's really about those conversations and those stories that are being told day to day about a brand. It's an interesting finding because it kind of conflicts with that.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you, Kalika.
Wow, we're being very, no one's moving. Riveting.
You need to dance a little.
Oh, they're going to see that on the recording. Okay. So what we may be seeing here is that someone could actually interact with the brand, fail to recognize the brand, and still hold their perceptions of the brand, which is in conflict with previous branding research. It's like brand awareness is where you start. So this is an interesting finding here. And additional research can hopefully start to figure out what's going on there. Lastly, with visiting the website, that had more of an impact on relationship and attitude than behavioral intent. And this supports previous research that says behavior change or relationship is cultivated online, but but it kind of conflicts with previous research that argues social is a primary source of communication between an organization and its public, and that it's an integral part of many people's lives. So when we look at some of the limitations of this study, which I've listed here for you, first starting with Amazon Turk, anytime that you use a sample that's collected on a platform like Amazon Turk, there's always the potential that there is something specific about those individuals that you're not seeing and that is affecting the results that you're getting. So using other recruitment methods in future research can help to address that. Increasing sample size is almost always a good thing in research, as we all know. And so that can probably help to address several of the things listed here. And then looking at the collinearity, I did find collinearity between attitude and relationship. So that, what we could do to kind of address that is future studies that use both of these scales see, okay, is this happening over and over again, or was this just with this particular study? In a perfect world, what would really help is to do a longitudinal study from the launch of a brand and health campaign through the relationship building process, and then actually seeing, is there behavior change? And that can really help to answer the question we were trying to look at with the models of where is relationship lie in this? Is it an independent variable? Is it a dependent variable? Is it a moderator? Come on in. So, in conclusion, what we were able to do is that using the relationship perspective for a branded health campaign showed some support. You know, public relations practitioners and branding experts are really good at being able to build relationships between an organization and its target public. And so we've seen some support for doing that here, and future research should continue to look in that area so that we can better guide health campaigns. In terms of the divide between how relationship should be studied, that continues, and there are scholars really calling out for clarity and consistency here, and that is something that still needs to be answered. Thank you so much.
Cidnee, if you want, you can sit through this part, or you can stand, whatever you feel most comfortable doing. So I have mostly directed all of my comments to Cidnee directly, so I'm not going to take a bunch of the time here. I will say something that kind of came to me as we get started that reminds me of another area of research. And so Cidnee was talking about that the brands didn't impact people, the brand did impact people even though they didn't necessarily remember the brand. And that reminds me a lot of negative political attack advertising. And so historically what you find is that people will remember and be impacted by the attack ad that they saw, but they won't necessarily remember, oh, it was this guy's enemy that paid for and produced and showed this entire attack. So so the attack itself becomes remembered and effective, and so kind of turning that on its head to look at actually a positive behavior, I think is really interesting. And that just struck me even after I've read this 1,000 times. So thank you for your presentation to highlight some of these other things that I had not necessarily focused on. What we typically do at this point is we ask questions, and so the committee members will ask questions to Cidnee. I'd like to do what's customary, and that's to start with our outside member, and then we'll go to Dr. Barker as well to see what she might have. So Miro, sorry. I was just thinking about my...
I kind of mind is Spiro, actually. So.
Yeah. I just heard a presentation from a woman whose advisor's name is Spiro, so he's on my brain. But he's brilliant too. So,
Good, brilliant.
Yes. Yes.
Good
So
company.
Professor Kopik, what questions or concerns do you have about Cidnee's thesis?
I think not a lot. I mean, it was disappointing that you couldn't look at the models and determine some kind of correlation either as a dependent or independent variable. The couple things that I noted was trying to reconcile the disparity in the research. You had two paths. So I'm, from a marketing point of view, so for all of you, I'm in the business school, and so looking at it from that perspective, on the marketing function, PR is an important component of what marketing does. How did you try to reconcile those two paths? You know, and it was really nice how you laid out the parallel research as it grew.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of commonality did you feel was really critical? And that was the one thing that I wanted to kind of clarify from you. That led to, you know, the way you structured the research.
So by using Sweetser and Kelleher's study, they actually used items from both sides of the table, if you will. And so I think that helped because, you know, since they were using items that were in both like kind of the IV side and the DV side, I think that helped. Now granted, they did look at it as multidimensional. They are thinking of it as, you know, on the dependent side, but there are similarities because they used items from both scales. So I think that helped to be able to kind of set this up in a way that, you know, it's not like we're using a scale that's totally only from one side or the other, if that makes sense. And you know, unfortunately, although they're saying it's independent or it's dependent, in terms of the measures themselves, they are oftentimes very similar conceptually and sometimes in terms even of the items.
Okay. In the way you structured the study, did you give consideration to, you know, and a couple of things, because you mentioned the Redger Bev does events. I'm wondering if they were fairly, you know, random statewide, or they were concentrated in certain communities, because you can then screen for people that potentially in those communities that could potentially have a higher incidence rate of having participated in an event. Did you have that information available?
I didn't, in my demographics, I didn't ask their specific location. I did all of Virginia. And with the campaign, it really does try to target all of Virginia.
Right.
In terms of their events, I could look into for you exactly where they've had them. But one thing when I was talking with Redger Bev is they're saying how they really scaled them back. So even
did they scale them back
in terms of having less of them?
Substantially prior to your research, or just prior to your research? So did they really scale them back, you know, a year or two prior, or within the few months prior to your research beginning?
So I could get specific details, but from the conversations I recall, it was within the last like year or so. Not, it was, you know, 2, 3, 5 years ago.
Did you consider screening for education to see if there may be correlations with sugary drink usage, consumption at different education levels, say, you know, high school and under, up through higher?
Up through a doctorate.
Oh, you're a doctorate. Again, I worked for PepsiCo for over 10 years, so I am a big fan. As Cidnee really does.
It's kind of ironic though that I have you working from PepsiCo and then her drinking PepsiCo. So, but I didn't look specifically at education. I did look at income to try and get at that, and so they were kind of towards the lower end of the spectrum, but like kind of, you know, middle class and then lower income. That's not the same as education, but that would be the closest, I'd say.
Would you say, following Dr. Sweetser's comment, that the brand name in and of itself, since it really didn't resonate with the mission of the organization in a way, could that be a factor in why people might remember the message but not the name of the organization?
So when I think of this, you know, I really think of, like, for example, Coca-Cola has an initiative to have a lower calorie drink to decrease the number of calories in beverages, but I would gather probably most of us don't actually know the name of it. But we may be aware that the initiative itself exists, and so I kind of think that maybe what's happening here is, you know, there's a lot of health campaigns out there, and people may take the message in and actually change their behavior, but not totally connect with the brand sometimes. But I think that's a good point in terms of, you know, maybe the branding isn't strong enough in some of their materials.
And I noted in some of the responses, the standard deviations were pretty wide. How do you, you know, what do you think of that? How do you think that impacts the interpretation that you had?
Yeah, so in terms of the standard deviations being wide, I think that's probably normal. You know, there's some people who are very health conscious, and there's some people who, you know, really drink sugar-sweetened beverages whenever they want.
Right.
Is there something in particular that you'd like me to look at, kind of related to the standard deviation?
No, I was, you know, because sometimes, you know, in the whole notion of false positives, when you have such a wide swing with, outside of water, there was pretty much radical swings in every other beverage category. How would you know, especially in the area of the bad for you drink, so to speak. So I was just curious if you have a hypothesis or you know, that it might impact attitudes, or do you think there were any false positives in the research results?
Yeah, I think, you know, with any research, I don't think any study is totally, completely, we have one study and then we know 110%. How, you know, I think research really has to work is looking at multiple studies. So, you know, unfortunately, since this I'll be done after this, fingers crossed. But Rev Bev has actually talked to me about continuing to do this kind of research to get more data and kind of look at this more in depth. And so I think those additional studies will really help to tap into this. I don't think it would make sense to look at this and say, okay, good, now we know, let's all go home. I think you have to really look at multiple studies over the course of time, especially when you're talking about behavior change campaigns, which do take time.
It's great as an organization that they're invested, and I think that speaks a lot to you as a practitioner in straddling both of these worlds.
Would they help fund getting the right level of you know, sample size and things like that to have a better understanding? I hope that they would do that.
They have to. It ain't coming out of her pocket.
This is over. So looking back at the whole process, what would you say if you had to start all over again? What would you change in your approach, if anything?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think obviously we're not in Virginia because the weather's beautiful and there's palm trees, so you guys probably knew that. But one of the challenges I had was that I couldn't do like on the ground surveys. I couldn't say like, oh, let me actually go out there and go to, you know, like a grocery store and look at it from that perspective. So Amazon Turk was great in the sense that it could help me get those Virginians without physically being in Virginia. But I think that some of the drawbacks was that I really had trouble getting a larger sample size, simply because there's only so many people on Amazon Turk, and then there's only so many of those people that are from Virginia. So that would be the biggest thing, is that in a perfect world, all the money in the world, I think doing on the ground efforts would really be helpful. And we actually have several, this campaign in particular is from my, where I work, and so they have several initiatives in Virginia, and so they do some on the ground efforts, but it just like, it didn't line up. And so I'm hoping that this is something they'll adopt for their future research.
And then one last question. When you started working with them on this project, did you talk to anybody who attended an event and interviewed them formally to kind of better understand how you would frame the questionnaire that you developed?
So I had the questionnaire actually completely approved by the head of research for our state and local team, and so we sat side by side and went through every single question, which was fun because then I had to go say, hey, Sweetser, can we change this, and this? And then she'd say, okay, well, just tell them to change this. And I have to go back and say, hey, Shannon, can we change this? So I really wanted them to be a part of this because they are doing some of the research in that area, and so they're going to really be able to understand that. Although I was interested in looking at relationships specifically, I wanted to make sure they had buy-in, and there were specific changes made because the head of research there wanted to have them made. So definitely collaborated there.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for your questions.
I don't want to say we saved the best for last, but sorry, we did. Yes.
And I see a lot of the pink tabs there, so I'm just gonna sit back and
You should explain that earlier so that she didn't kind of get scared about it.
she
It's
does.
more for me than her. First of all, before I forget, this whole thing about not remembering or, you know, the campaign or whatever. One thing that occurred to me, especially as you got results for behavioral change for the child, I wondered if you maybe had a level of social desirability here in the answers from, you know, especially, I hate to be stereotypical in terms of role, but from mom. You know, because I can't believe that there's any mom out there who doesn't know that, you know, Coke or whatever is not good for their kids, their teeth and all of that. And so I wondered whether they may have been thinking, either consciously or unconsciously, oh boy, you know, I should say, you know, that I'm going to limit their intake. You know, we can't know that. And I wish I'd thought of that before, because there are ways of assessing for that in research, social desirability answers. So there's that. Really had less questions than comments, you know, because I think you've pretty much, you know, covered the deal. First of all, because I'm not a public relations person, and I don't know whether you felt this way too, I think that all the way through when you're presenting this, and I hope you'll be presenting it in other venues, that instead of saying relationship, you say organizational public relationship, all the way through. Because if it was me, I'd be saying, what relationship is she talking about, you know? And that may be completely like, duh, if you're in PR, but if you're not, then that may be a thing. It's a small thing, but
No, that totally makes sense.
yeah, because like it gets to page 27 before you really define what you're talking about in terms of a relationship. And then you start talking about organization, public relationship from that point on. So I find that you did a fabulous job of discussing all of the different definitions and research it relates to that. But I was still, you know, so I kind of got to a point in your paper where I'm saying, but what's your definition? What's your definition in the case of this study? And it was page 27 before I actually saw how you were defining it. So I thought you did a great job of telling us the history and the evolution of this concept. But we really need to know, okay, what do you mean by relationship in this case? Let's see. So you had the models, and it was unfortunate. There were a number of reasons why that I think would not work out in terms of, you know, there is a statistical procedure that you can use to test a model. But in this case, that would definitely not have worked, partly, I think, because of your sample size and the number of variables that you had in the questionnaire, and partly because the bivariate relationships were small. But it was unfortunate that that couldn't happen. I'm very interested in this idea of, you know, attitude being a moderator. And I think hopefully at some time in the future that could be examined, because that's what we're talking about. We have a relationship here. I think I've got this the right way around, then attitude in middle, and then behavior. And that kind of makes sense, but it could also be the other way around. But at any level, we're looking at attitude as some kind of moderator somewhere of the relationship between relationship and behavior. Which leads me to the relationship that you saw between those two variables, attitude and relationship, which was very high. Very high. In the regression analysis, where attitude predicted
Relationship.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
Very,
OPR.
very,
I take that back.
very high. You know, and the variance explained was very, very high. So we're not going to care about this right now, but my suggestion would be is that you may have here two dimensions of one construct. So one is the relationship dimension and the other is the attitude dimension, and they're kind of somehow coming together to measure something bigger. And I do remember that when we looked at the data, we did see some cross-loading between those two variables, and so it would be interesting in future research to test out different scales where you, I mean, I don't know how Dr. Sweetser feels about this, but where you take out those problematic items in the questionnaire that were cross-loading, and therefore you can then say, okay, these are definitely discrete variables. They're not the same thing. So I think you've got a lot of very interesting dynamics going on in this data set, and I would encourage you, I know you absolutely want to say goodbye to this by now, but when the dust settles, you might talk to Dr. Sweetser and think about how can we go back and look at this data set and get something perhaps more productive out of it, because I think that the possibility there that you can. Let's see. You kind of asked the question I was going to ask. Well, how would you revisit this if you had to over again? And that brings me to the models again, because definitively, if at some time in the future you were to rerun this research, my suggestion would be that you run it as an experiment, because when you're using correlational data like this, you can't definitively ever say this is antecedent to this caused this, because it's just not that kind of tool that you can use. But you could have actually run an online experiment through MTurk using these folks. You could have directed them to certain stimulus material from ReviewBeth and asked them additional questions about the digital, their digital presence and how much they knew about that. And you could then have determined, okay, what is the most effective explanation, chicken egg wise. So again, further research. Overall, I have to say that I think you did a great job, and I'm sorry that the sample size was not big enough to achieve quite what you set out to. So that's all I have. I don't really have questions for you. I think you basically asked and answered the things that I might have. These little pink tickets, by the way, are, for the most part, very small things. So occasionally there's a typo. Occasionally there's an APA style thing in there, which I've pointed out there. I have asked for maybe a sentence change or two here and there. And also, with regard to the table that we were looking at just before, I wonder, in order to help the reader interpret table 1, you could include, like you have in the others, the ranges for those items. So when the reader is looking at the mean and the standard deviation, you can go, okay, that's super high. That's a great mean. Or wow, that's really low. What happened there? Like you can do in the other tables. So that's just a small thing. If you could add that into that table, I think that would increase the accessibility of the data to anyone who are reading it. And again, I would encourage you to, when you feel better after today, and maybe months, I don't know, but you do think about revisiting this and maybe going for a conference paper or, something or some kind of publication with it, because I think that's the ultimate, isn't it? To be published, even if you're not an academic. It's there on your resume.
I think Cidnee is very much an academic, so I know that that's exactly what she'll want. Well, I thank the committee members for their amazing comments and questions as well. If I could have everybody please clear the room then.
May I just do one more thing before we clear the room? So, I don't think that Dr. Sweetser was necessarily the first to say this, but I will remember it forever because of her. Dr. Sweetser, thank you for all you have taught me during my time at here at SDSU and specifically to my thesis. You have made me a better professional and even an academic, which I'm really excited about. And I so appreciate you. To my wonderful parents who are here, thank you so much. You guys have been incredibly supportive and have made so many sacrifices for me to be able to get to this moment, and I appreciate you more than I could ever say. To Seth, who is my partner in life, is on the other side of the country right now, but I know he's cheering me on. Whenever I'd be like, oh, like Sweetser just painted my paper in purple. Like, she always grades in purple, fancy. But he always would encourage me, and I appreciated that. And with Rescue, who not only supported this work by allowing me to work with their brand, but also I was working full time while doing my master's and for all of my thesis, and they have been so understanding. So I really appreciate them. To my lovely committee members, thank you for guiding me. My thesis is infinitely better because of each and every one of you, and I so appreciate you letting me come to your office hours, emailing me my 50 billion questions. Thank you so very much. And definitely last, but definitely not least, to all of my loved ones, my family, my friends, everyone who was here, and those, I got so many well wishes as I was coming in here and being like, you're gonna do great. So, all of those who have supported me, I am so very thankful. And I'm thinking I hopefully won't bleed in war now, because I definitely sweated in training. So, thank you so much, guys.
Way to guilt us to a decision.